We're going to have a few video programs here looking at illustrations. So in these, I want to talk to you about the elements of art that you'll see in illustration, the various medium that illustrators use, styles, and then we'll look at some famous Alaskan artists. So let's start with the art elements. Some of you might remember these from art classes you've taken here and there. And let's see how these play out in some examples of children's books. Ted Harrison is a very famous artist from the Yukon, and his color is fantastic. I think he probably represents the Northern Lights better than any illustrator. And you can see it's fanciful, it's very bold, and if you took the first look that you'd have at this picture, you'd think color. Shape is an element, and Mindy Dwyer used shape throughout her book Quilt of Dreams. A quilt is a great representation of shape, but you can also see in her cat and her socks that shape really jumps out at you. And then I think color also jumps out. Line is an element that we find in most art. I chose this book, Anna's Athabascan Summer, to talk about line because in this lovely book, it's about being out on the river during the fish camp time. And the river that you can see flowing horizontally with the lines and the line of the horizon pretty much flows through the book. It's a picture book that's horizontal, and so we have two pages like this next to each other, and you get this very flat, flowing feeling of the river and its constants, and we use line to show that. I think it's a really wonderful book and a great example of how line can enhance an illustrated book. Here we have texture, and you can see in this wood block that the texture of, especially of the floor, is very prominent in the picture. You get a real sense of there's roughness and there's grain to what we see in the picture. Pattern is another element. I chose this example, a little picture book by Ernestine Hayes, that has an example of how children's books often use pattern in borders around the books, and in this case it's just around one end of it, but a beautifully designed page will often have some kind of a pattern like that that just enhances the wholeness of the picture book. Cultural content is another element that we want to always consider. Very frequently, Native American and Alaska Native designs are integrated into illustration. This one I think is quite beautiful, but you want to be careful that there is respect shown to the traditions of the cultural content that you find in an illustration. So we have just looked at the art elements that you would see in any art and that you'll be looking for in illustrated picture books. Another thing you want to become aware of is the medium. The medium means what kind of artistic tools did the artist use to make that illustration. And sometimes this really takes some detective work. I enjoy trying to figure out what the medium of a picture book is, but sometimes there's some clues. For example, I found this on the inside page of one of the books that we'll show you that exactly tells you what the medium is, cut paper. And sometimes when it's something interesting, if you look around and find this this page, which is often at the back of a picture book, it'll help you figure out what the medium was, what were the materials. So let's take a look at some artists' mediums. Very common is the use of oil or acrylic painting, and you know, if you look closely at a picture, like I zoomed in on this one, you can often see the thickness of the brush strokes, and that will give you a clue that it's oil or acrylic. Oil paints are a little more subtle, and acrylic paints are more chemical, and so sometimes you can figure out if it's oil or acrylic by the intensity of the color, and I would guess that this one is probably an oil. Woodblock is a common medium in children's illustration where a piece of wood is actually carved and then it's used to make a print, and in this case it was colored in. Here's another example of a woodblock. This is from Kate Besser's alphabet book, but this is different because the picture is actually of the woodblock, and you can see the grain of the wood there, and she carved it back, and then she painted the front of the woodblock. So that's interesting. Probably the most common medium in children's illustration is watercolor. There's something about the softness and the transparency of watercolor that goes very well with children's books, and since they're small, since watercolor is not as bright often as other paints, the smallest of the pictures, it works. And in this one, the red, of course, is pretty bright, but if you were looking at this in a big picture on a wall, it probably wouldn't be as white. One clue to watercolor is just to look for transparency. And if you look like in the basket, you could see how those little weaving parts of the basket and then the circles on the ends of them, that's a clue to the watercolor, and also the beautiful colors in the face. So you'll find a lot of watercolor in children's books. Some books are made with very ornately cut papers, and then they're layered on. David Wisniewski is an award-winning illustrator who does this kind of very fine work. And one of the things I like about it is the little shadow that you see in the photographs of the cut paper. Probably the most famous collage artist in America is Eric Carle, who's been making collages since the 1960s, where you either use some kind of paper that's already printed, or you paint your paper and then you cut it out and use it in a new way. In this one you can see he finger painted and did some other kind of rough paintings and then cut them out and put them together into a new picture. Also very, very common in children's illustration is mixed medium. And that means that the artist used more than one thing. So this kind of picture is very common. It's a watercolor, but it's also got either a marker or pen and ink, the black lines. Probably the black lines were drawn first and then it was filled in with watercolor. So it's fun to look at pictures and see if you can figure out what different mediums were used, and if you think you find more than one, just call it mixed medium. Makes it easy to recognize. Of course, photographs, and when you're looking for photographs, you want to find excellence. This particular book I think was quite excellent because the little boy's red hat is very, very prominent in all the pictures that are a snowy, dark background. So this red shows up in the black and white. Pencil. Pencil was the way that most children's books were illustrated, probably up through the 1950s. And this is an old book, a famous Alaska book, Deniki by William Barry, but he used the really old-fashioned now form of pencil for illustration. He was a wildlife artist. Pen and ink also emphasizes line. This is the original copy of On Mother's Lap that has, it's got pen and ink and then it's filled in with some sort of sepia colors. and I think it's beautiful. I actually prefer this to the modern On Mother's Lap. Pastel, you know, that's a chalk. And when you use pastel, you often can put it on a colored paper. In this one, it's on a kind of a brownish paper that you can see in the texture of the picture. Colored pencil. Wow, colored pencil is an amazing medium and a lot of work to fill in all that with those fine lines of a colored pencil. But Terry Sloat is an Alaskan artist who does a lot of that. Scratchboard means you might remember the art projects you did when you were young where you drew a picture and then you colored all over it with black crayon, and then you took a bobby pin and scratched off and you made a design. Scratchboard is a little more complicated than that because you put the picture in and then you cover it with a black sort of paint and then scratch it off. This book, The Girl Who Swam with the Fish, I hope you have a chance to look at it. It's a pretty remarkable picture. This is very, very labor-intensive illustration. We see a lot of materials in children's books that are computer generated. And this one, this is mixed medium, but it also has some stuff that you can tell is done by computer. This line that goes up and down, where you've got this sort of textured paper on one side and then this torn sort of line, that is pretty obviously done by computer. And then the dotted line would be something computer generated in with those little paintings.